coronavirus wreaks havoc around the world, many fingers still continue to be pointed at the World Health Organization along with the Chinese authorities for failing to act promptly during the initial days of the outbreak in the Chinese city of Wuhan. The initial days and weeks of the coronavirus outbreak are now being considered very crucial. This was when the UN agency was trying to find ways to understand the pathogen and methods to stem the spread to other nations. President Xi Jinping's administration sought to downplay the potential threat of the virus and initially lobbied against excessive actions such as the early declaration of a global health emergency and travel bans aimed at Chinese nationals. China, at that time, delayed providing the WHO with more detailed data on patients and cases, making it difficult for officials to judge whether the virus could spread between people and what risk it might mean for the rest of the world. In fact, Chinese officials sat on releasing the genetic map or genome of the deadly virus for over a week after multiple government labs had fully decoded it. This, in turn, harmed the entire world and allowed early virus carriers to travel around the world, belating the global response to pandemic. Now, the question is that did China have political sway at the World Health Organization? The question comes into focus because of the United Nations agency's own repeated delays in conducting an independent research to understand the virus and human-to-human transmission. It failed to brand the outbreak as a pandemic for precious weeks when the outbreak was gaining force. It also continued to publicly praise China for showcasing their apparent transparency. This while China was faltering with its deadline to provide any epidemiological information. The organization's major structural weakness is that it relies on information from its member countries, and the WHO team that visited China in February to evaluate the response did so jointly with China's representatives. The resulting report never held China accountable for the delays. In fact, the delegation commended the commitment, capacity and even rapid identification that demonstrated by national, provincial and Wuhan authorities working to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. It failed to warn the world in time, and another month passed when the agency finally woke up from its slumber and declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Till then, the virus had already killed more than 4,000 people and infected 118,000 people worldwide. Was it a collective cover-up by both WHO and China? The world surely awaits the answers. For more details, let's quickly go across to Lucy Huff, our correspondent who's joining us live from Brussels at this hour. Thank you for joining our broadcast today, Lucy. Now, throughout January of 2020, the World Health Organization publicly praised China for what it called a speedy response to the new coronavirus. But behind the scenes, it was a much different story if we were to go by what we hear in the recordings. Why so?
Well, it seems that the WHO were publicly praising China in order to coax more information out of Beijing and to ensure that Beijing continued to cooperate with the WHO. But as you were hearing from those recordings which have been released to the Associated Press, there was private frustration about the lack of transparency, the lack of data, particularly about genome sequencing to the WHO in the early stages of the pandemic, that meant the WHO was not able to carry out its own investigations about how the virus was being transmitted, how contagious it was, and the potential impact this was going to have, preventing the body from advising on pandemic prevention plans because not enough was known. So there was some very public praise for China, but behind the scenes, more private criticism.
Right. Lucy, the other big question that everybody has been asking is what has China seek to gain by delaying the information that included the timely release of the genetic map or genome?
Well, that is, as you say, the million-dollar question, but we do know that China is keen to sort of control the narrative on this. I mean, you only have to look at the mission to Wuhan carried out by members of a WHO team, how tightly controlled that operation is. The trip was meant to happen a couple of weeks ago, but the visas were suspended temporarily because a couple of people in the team had tested positive for COVID-19 antibodies. Finally, the team were allowed into China, but what we are seeing is a very coordinated, sort of careful, choreographed mission, not giving those individuals full access to what's going on the ground. For example, One Wuhan resident wants to be able to speak to the WHO team who lost a parent early on in this crisis. Whether or not that access will be given remains to be seen. But we know that China is keen to sort of keep giving a positive spin on this. You know, it claims that there was it wasn't necessarily the place where the pandemic began, that there were other possibilities as well. So it is a bit of a kind of PR exercise. But certainly China is keen to be perceived to be playing along with the WHO, to be allowing transparency. But again, what we are seeing behind the scenes is a slightly different story.
Right. Since you mentioned the current probe, Lucy, that the WHO failed to warn the world in time about the original outbreak also raises concerns about the current probe being conducted by the WHO team in China. What's your assessment about the current probe's authenticity?
Well, the probe is due to begin in earnest at the end of this week. The team that arrived there 14 days ago, or just under 14 days ago, have been in quarantine in hotels. They've been carrying out virtual meetings with Beijing and Wuhan authorities. But as I say, this is a year after the event, after the beginning of the pandemic in Wuhan, and they face an immensely difficult job to try and ascertain how this virus transmitted to human beings and why it was able to spread so quickly in the community. There will be great difficulties in determining whether or not there was a cover-up in the early stages of the number of people that were infected in Wuhan, in the early stages of that pandemic, the amount of lives that were lost, given that 12 months have now passed, over 12 months since those early stages. So it will be immensely challenging, but as you were hearing there is private frustration from WHO officials about the amount of information they're being given, the amount of data that's available to them. So they will have to negotiate hard to get their hands on that data in the weeks to come.
Absolutely. While fingers have already been raised at China for long, there's also now the question of WHO's credibility that's coming under the spotlight. Having said that, thank you so much, Lucy Hough, for joining us from Brussels with all those details.